in Mark 8, Jesus brings the question front and center, and he asks, "Who do people say that I am?" And welcome back to Teach Through the Word, the podcast for Bible teachers. Kris Lang, I'm back with you in the studio. With me again, Peyton Jones. How you doing, Peyton?
Hey, hey.
And back at the producer's chair once again, Jonathan Ferguson. There he is. There's Jonathan.
I'm here behind the
Welcome,
scenes.
guys. All right, guys, this is day 3. We are in the middle of our series about the book of Mark. Today, we're actually going to dive into some content. We're going to dive into a few of the teachings and how I put that together for the Through the Word series. And this is going to give us a little more down to earth, down to where the rubber meets the road on putting together a singular message through one of Mark's stories or one of Mark's chapters. So we are here to equip you, Bible teacher, to do what you do better, and together with you to elevate the craft of Bible teaching. So let's get into it. Get equipped, get trained. And while you're at it, get a little behind the scenes look here at Through the Word. So Peyton, why don't you start us out? Where are we going?
Well, I know one of the challenges to taking a 10-minute app and covering a whole chapter, particularly in a gospel, is that you've got maybe 4, 5, 6 stories in each chapter. So one of the major questions I have, and I know that guys that are trying to cover a chapter a week in the pulpit know they can't cover it all, is how did you know what to highlight as you were moving through your teaching? Which stories did you pick and why?
I'd say this is part Holy Spirit and part looking at the necessity of your audience. And I will balance it with this. If you don't do that, if you teach through something as dense as a gospel, especially Mark's gospel, which is very dense, if you try to teach every nook and cranny, you could end up here for years. And I think any of us who've been teaching the Bible for a while, as Peyton hangs his head in shame, we can say we have spent years on a book of the Bible where we realize, okay, we got a lot out of that, but your congregation needed some other things, needed to get somewhere. So one of the first things you have to do is decide how much time is appropriate to teach this. So you got 16 chapters in Mark. If you're teaching 4 chapters a month, that's going to take you 4 months, which is a pretty fast clip through the book of Mark. If you do 2 weeks per chapter, you got 8 months there. So you want to do a little bit of math and figure out how long you want to take. If you do the 1 chapter per message, you don't want to teach every story. So I, with Through the Word, was kind of bought in that that's what I have to do. And so I had to pick each story out of each chapter. And the methodology there was the prompting of the Spirit. Sometimes it was my favorite story, but more than that, it was following the greater flow of Mark's gospel. Where is Mark going with this? And Mark is primarily helping us to ask the question, who is Jesus? And so in each chapter, I'm picking what's the story that really gets to the heart of that question? What's the central story here? So in chapter 1, my focus was Jesus inviting the disciples, follow me, because that really opens the story up. That opens the gospel of Mark with that invitation. I want to bring my audience in with that invitation. Follow me. In chapter 2, I'm following Jesus is healing the lame man, and so I love that story personally. So I opened it up, but it also was central, and Jesus kind of highlights it by saying, "So that you may know that the Son of Man has authority." That was something I realized Jesus wants us to know. So I'm going to camp my story there, and I put the focus there. So chapter by chapter, I'm bringing out the story that I think really stands out. Usually it's the ones in Mark that highlight who Jesus is, or cause me to challenge me to ask the question, who is this?
That's good. So tell us about some of the specific chapters. Like, what about chapter 5? You kind of shifted gears and you went kind of personal there. Why'd you do that?
So I hit Mark chapter 5. It's the story of the demoniac. I know that Jonathan would chime in. That's his favorite story. I think one of his favorite stories in the Bible. And the story of the demoniac, I decided to highlight there, and I did it a different way. Most of the time I was highlighting the challenge of who Jesus is, but some of the times I'm getting to know the disciples because their stories in this too. And I really see myself as the teacher introducing my audience to Jesus, but also to the disciples to get their perspective. And in this case, I want to introduce them to the demoniac, because it does not treat the demoniac as a lesson to be learned for all those who are for his audience. He's not a case study. He's not a doctor leading doctors in training into the room while somebody's got their rear end in the air that's about to get operated on. Jesus always interacts personally with them, so we've got to do the same thing. We've got to interact with them. So to connect with a demoniac, who for most of us is a very other person that we don't relate to, I decided to tell the story of a good friend of mine, Zach Martinez. Great guy. I don't know if you guys, I know Jonathan knows Zach. Peyton, I don't know if you knew Zach, but incredible guy, big influence in my life. And he spent 13 years of his life demon possessed. He went through this, and he's a very real person. His story is very relatable, although albeit extreme. And I decided to tell his story. And actually what you have on the app now is my second telling of that story, because I had to go back. I had a lot of people respond to it, very thankful, but I had one woman, a mom, who wrote me and said, I was so encouraged at first, but then I was so discouraged when you didn't draw a clear line between demon possession and mental illness. And I had to apologize, because those two things kind of wove together in Zach's story. And I had to apologize and say, oh, wait. And so I went back, actually re-recorded, and I told the story. Zach's story interweaves with my dad's story. My dad walked through bipolar disorder. That was part of my story. And so I told all of that, and it makes the story of the demoniac much more connective and relatable. That's really where the whole story met me personally.
You know, as a previous psych nurse and someone who has done, a fair share of exorcisms, drawing that distinction, I think, is so helpful to the listener, because that's going to be the number one question people have is, are these the same thing? There's a lot of different opinions. We'll assure you they are not the same thing. Sometimes one can be a symptom, but here's the deal. You really drawing that clear distinction that mental illness is mental illness is very, very helpful. But obviously, if you're demonically possessed, that's going to work havoc on your psyche. So, but I like that you brought that out, that, hey, the one might sometimes bleed into the other, but there's also that desire to protect people with mental illness, and they need to be protected by teachers. But, on another level, you've got Mark 8, which I know is kind of the fulcrum of the book there. And the way you approached that, really, it was different, and it showed kind of a mastery of the craft of teaching, and that you pulled in an article and didn't use it as your text from preaching, but you interacted. You had a conversation with an article, and I thought that was absolutely brilliant. Can you walk us through why you did that and how it applied to the central message of Mark's gospel?
Well, glad you appreciated that one. That was a carefully crafted message. You have to know that what you're getting when you hear my final version of a Through the Word study is literally a couple of decades of preparation. So that article is something that I clipped and set aside, must have been 15, 20 years ago, out of Newsweek. And it was just an article in Newsweek that was called The Other Jesus. And the article was about Jesus from the perspective of the Hindu, the Muslim, the Buddhist, and it walked through. And first of all, it was just fascinating. It was just an interesting article. It was a well put together article. I liked it, but I saved that, and I save all of my articles, stories, things like that. I save them and I tag them now. It used to be a big binder, and so I had it there, but now I just save them in a notes app. I use Evernote, but you can use anything. As a preacher, you've got to be a collector of good stories. And so I save that for just the right time. Well, Mark chapter 8 is indeed the heart of the book. If you follow Mark's story, it is following Jesus and seeing step by step, who is this? And the disciples ask, who is this, in Mark chapter 4? And statements here and there so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority. You're getting a little glimpse of who Jesus is. But in Mark 8, Jesus brings the question front and center, and he asks, who do people say that I am? Now, that's not the central question yet. The central question is coming. The absolute crux of the whole book, the gravity of the book, it kind of weighs in when Jesus turns to the disciples and says, who do you say that I am? And as you teach, that needs to weigh as your central point of Mark. To me, as we were talking about this before, Peyton, and you mentioned, it's sort of like Jesus breaks the fourth wall. and looks at the audience. And we've got to do the same thing as the teacher and say, who do you say that Jesus is? Well, I didn't want to just jump to there. That's the main thing. So I wanted to use a device to help people arrive there. And that article that I had saved for years really served as the perfect methodology, the perfect tool to help me walk my listeners through that. And so I walked through a little bit of the article to say, who do Hindus say that Jesus is? I don't agree with everything they say, but it's fascinating. Who do Muslims say that Jesus is? He's a prophet. He's all kinds of interesting things to them. So it was interesting, but it also came with a journalist's perspective, which is a powerful tool because a journalist speaks differently than a teacher does. A journalist is observational and that fits Mark's gospel well because it's really observing but leading to something. There are authoritative declarations there, but Mark allows you time to develop that perspective. And so that journalist observation worked well. And I decided that it was such a useful tool that I wove it in with Mark chapter 8. I didn't just say, here's the whole thing. Weaving is an essential teaching gift because it keeps bringing back elements. So I introduced it when Jesus said, who do others say that I am? I presented that part of the article. But then when Jesus went to who do you say that I am, I started bringing out that there was the part of the article that addressed places where it was the cross, where other religions can't handle that part of Jesus' story. And so Jesus, when he says, who do you say that I am? And then he goes on to say what he must do. He will be killed and on the third day rise again. I went on to say the other religions can't handle this. And again, it's still outside perspective. And I don't like challenge them and say they're all wrong. I just bring now this new part of the story. How do we deal with the crucifixion? And that's where, and if you follow the greater story in Mark from here on out, from Mark chapter 8 on out, we've been walking uphill with him right after it's the transfiguration, the revelation of who Jesus is from there. The rest of it is going downhill into the Kidron Valley and going to be up to the hill of Golgotha. And that's the story that we're following him on.
Right. And, until I had heard your kind of breaking that open as that is what Jesus does when he turns and breaks a fourth wall, I had never seen that as being kind of everything Mark was leading up to. And I remember talking with you about it, saying, I did not know that when I took Refuge Long Beach through that book, but man, would I teach it differently with that understanding. And I think sometimes when a book cracks open, there's no greater joy as a teacher, right? When you're prepping and the book just opens itself up to you and you feel like you see the matrix in it, and it's so cool. But two observations. That's my first one. My second one is what I loved about your use of an article and bringing everyone to that was a conversation, particularly on a hot topic, is asking the questions everyone else has, which is what John does in his gospel, right? When he records all these things, they're asking for us all these conversational questions that we would have if we were in a conversation with Jesus. But my mind also went back to Charles Spurgeon, who, when evolution hit the scene back in his day, he actually took a statue of a monkey and put it up on the pulpit and had a conversation. That was his sermon. And the cleverness of taking other people's conversations and answering, because he would answer back as the monkey. And, it's just one of those things where somebody used their creativity to present truth. And it just was a masterstroke. I know we're running out of time, but
taking people through an experience. It's walking people through an experience because those stay with you. And so that putting the monkey on the pulpit or walking through an article that's interesting and learning step by step and thinking through piece by piece, that experience stays with you and you own the results of it. And so I waited for the end of that chapter to say, what about you? Who do you think he is? And then I asked also, well, as for me, and I shared just a little bit of my decision making, because I want to help them decide for themselves who Jesus is, not just put it out there. Jesus is the Son of God. Done. Amen. We're no arguments. Like, there are arguments out there. People go through them. People think through them. We need to help them process that. All right, you're keeping us on
And
time and I'm not, so I'll let you take it.
no, it's all right, because this is actually worth slowing down for, which again is something that you often say, which we'll come to when we go
Yes.
through Colossians. This is worth slowing down for, which again is a
Yes.
teaching point, because I think this next point is so important. We're going to come to Matthew chapter 10, where you
Mark,
actually
yes.
shift. I'm sorry, Mark chapter 10, and you shifted from the expositor, the teacher, to the shepherd. You actually came across a topic, and you shifted. And I want to kind of dig down into that a little bit, because there's times where you're teaching where you put a different hat on, and it takes experience, and I would say the leading of the Holy Spirit, to know, okay, I've got to handle this one differently. Talk to us about Mark chapter 10. What happened and what did you do?
So Mark 10, where I ended up is not where I started. And where I ended up was a full study on divorce. I taught the whole thing through Jesus teaching on divorce. And when I first sat down, I had an outline for all the elements of Mark chapter 10. One of my favorite stories is in there about the rich young ruler. I really wanted to go there because it's so good. And I ended up just camping on the divorce question because a sense in my heart told me there's going to be a listener who this is a painful subject. And the moment I say divorce, this is going to bring up some questions and some hurt, that they may have been hurt by the church in the teaching on divorce. So I needed to stop there and be pastoral, that my responsibility was not just to the text and to exposit it, but my responsibility was to my listener. And I'll say this, it's really interesting. Although most of the chapters of Mark, I hit the main topics, the main stories. In Mark 5 and 10, I got very personal with Zach's story and my dad's story and his years of bipolar disorder. And then in the divorce story, which is also very personal to me because my parents are divorced and I share a little bit of that. And I got personal. Those are the two that I get the most response from. I get email about Zach's story. I get email about the divorce story, because people needed to hear that and I needed to be sensitive to that. So when I stopped in divorce, honestly, what happened for me is I had all this content and the divorce part kept getting longer and longer, and it just had to push everything else. And I'll probably work the rest someday onto a B-side. But the divorce story, what I had to do with Jesus' teaching is I had to first recognize that there was hurt. I had to first step into their shoes. And I did a couple things to recognize that. When God says, I hate divorce, I say, you know what? I think God hates divorce in the same way that divorced people hate divorce. Because I needed to acknowledge that it doesn't say God hates divorced people, because that's sometimes the way people feel. But it says God hates divorce. And you know what? I knew my parents, they hated divorce. Most everybody I know who's gone through divorce hates divorce. Well, why is that? And so then I slowed it down, got into their shoes, sat down in the pulpit with them, heard the messages that they've been hearing, which are messages of condemnation about divorce, and then sat down with them and say, all right, I know Jesus didn't come to condemn. So what is with this passage? And I slowed it down to that level and then broke it down verse by verse. What is Jesus saying? I know Jesus came to forgive, to encourage, to bring hope and healing, but he addresses divorce. But I didn't ignore the fact that Jesus says that divorce for any other reason but adultery is sin. So I broke it down. And when you get that, you've got to ask, okay, what does he say there? And you got to help unpack. There's all kinds of baggage with a subject like this. You got to release the baggage, acknowledge it, but release the baggage and say, what does the text say? And what is the context? And what does the rest of the text say? So we really get to the heart of this passage and do so in a way that someone is willing to hear and can get some healing.
Yeah, it's so good. So this is one of the things that Kris and I are the most excited about, is slowing down and actually showing you some isolated examples of how these passages were handled. Now, we're going to be coming back to this every week that we're in a Bible book. So thanks again for joining us today. And Kris, I'll let you sign us out.
Nice. Thanks, Peyton. And thanks for sticking around a couple extra minutes, everybody, on Teach Through the Word, the podcast for Bible teachers. Each week here at Teach Through the Word, we will bring you one Bible book or one teaching essential. Or when we get some opportunity, we're going to get some guest teachers in here for an interview. I'm excited about that as we equip you, Bible teacher, to do what you do better, and together with you to elevate the craft of Bible teaching. Peyton Jones, thanks so much. Jonathan, thanks for working the producer studio. We will see all of you back here next time on Teach Through the Word.